Imagine yourself in the heart of the world in the year of the Christian calendar 1519. You are in Tenochtitlan. The air, thick with the scent of water lilies from the canals and the sacred smoke of copal incense, feels heavy, expectant. The murmur of a million souls, a constant hum of commerce and life, seems quieter today. Even the volcanic peaks that ring the valley, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, seem to hold their breath under the high blue sky. This is the city of wonders, a metropolis built on water, connected by great causeways and alive with the vibrant colors of the marketplace. But in the chambers of the great palace, the colors are muted by shadow and fear. Huitzilopochtli Moctezuma II sat not on his throne, but on a low stool, his gaze fixed on the pictographic reports spread across the reed mats. They showed the impossible. Floating mountains spitting fire and smoke, men clad in metal that shone like the sun, and monstrous, hornless deer that moved with the speed of the wind. His knuckles were white where he gripped the stool. "They are signs," whispered the high priest, his voice thin as a wisp of smoke. His name was Takum, and his face, wrinkled like dried parchment, was a mask of grim piety. The cycles turn. The prophecies of the returning god Quetzalcoatl. They are not gods. The voice cut through the reverent hush. It was deep, steady, and devoid of fear. It belonged to Itzcoatl, commander of the Jaguar Knights, a man whose face was all sharp angles and hard planes, carved from a life of war and pragmatism. He stood with the unshakable stillness of a predator. Takum, the high priest, turned slowly, his black eyes glittering with offense. "You speak of things beyond your station, Commander. You see only the world of men. We must see the world of the gods." "And I see men who bleed and die," Itzcoatl countered, his voice never rising, yet it filled the room. "I have read the reports from the coast. These gods fell to the arrows of the Totonacs. They hunger, they sicken, and they can be killed." Moctezuma looked from one man to the other, his own conflict mirrored in their opposition. He was the great speaker, the vessel of the empire's will, yet he felt voiceless. "The omens," Itzcoatl. "A comet of fire, the wailing woman in the night. We cannot ignore the will of the universe." "Or perhaps," Itzcoatl said, taking a deliberate step forward, "a comet is just a star, and a woman weeps for a reason we have not yet found. We are the Aztec. We are the people of the sun. Our empire was not built by waiting for omens, but by making them. These invaders understand one thing, force, not the ritual of the flower war where we seek captives for the gods." He glanced at the high priest. "But a war of annihilation, a war to cleanse our shores." The high priest recoiled as if struck. "Blasphemy, to deny the gods their due, to spill blood for mere conquest and not for holy sacrifice. That is the path to ruin. It would unravel the very fabric of our world." Itzcoatl's gaze did not waver. He looked past the priest, directly at his emperor. "The world has already unraveled, great speaker. These men are the proof. The only question is whether we will be the ones to weave it back together, or be swept away as dust." The first battle on the great causeway was not a battle. It was a butchering. Itzcoatl watched from a command post on the rooftop of a temple, his jaw set like granite. He saw his finest jaguar and eagle warriors, men who were legends in their own time, charge forward with the roar of predators. He saw them crash against the Spanish line, a thin wall of steel and grim resolve. The sound was what he would remember most. The sickening thump asterisk of obsidian-studded clubs, the fearsome asterisk Macuahuitl asterisk, shattering against steel breastplates, leaving the European soldiers merely bruised and staggering. And then the reply, the clean, high-pitched asterisk shing asterisk of Toledo steel as it sliced through the padded cotton armor of his warriors as if it were water. For every Spaniard who fell, 10 of his own men lay bleeding on the stone causeway. Then came the horses. Those thunderous beasts, carrying armored men like demigods, crashed into the Aztec flank. The disciplined ranks, so effective against other Mesoamerican armies, dissolved into a screaming mob. It was not a failure of courage, Itzcoatl knew. It was a failure of imagination. His people could not conceive of such a weapon. In the weeks that followed, the Spaniards laid siege to the city. Cortés, in his fortified camp, was patient. He had seen it before. The true weapon was not steel, nor was it the horse or the cannon. It was the silent, invisible ally that traveled in the blood and breath of his men. He waited for the city to begin to die. He waited for the screams to turn from those of war to those of agony, for the defenders on the walls to grow weak and stumble, their faces covered in the damning pustules of smallpox. And he waited. Inside Tenochtitlan, a fever swept through the districts. People fell ill with racking coughs and aching bones. The healers were busy, administering teas of willow bark and placing cool cloths on fevered brows. Itzcoatl, walking through a makeshift hospital, saw the misery. But he did not see the horror he had been warned of. He saw men who were gravely ill, but he also saw men who were recovering. The sickness came, it raged for a week, and then, for most, it receded. Their bodies were scarred with a mild rash, but not the disfiguring boils of the apocalypse. In his tent, a Spanish captain reported to a frowning Cortés, "Their numbers on the wall do not diminish, sir. If anything, their resolve seems to harden. We hear chanting, not weeping." Cortés waved a hand in dismissal. "It is a matter of time, another week. God will deliver them to us." But Itzcoatl, standing with one of the city's most ancient healers, knew the truth. The old woman looked up at him, her eyes clear. "It is a fierce cockalissly asterisk," she said, using the Nahuatl word for pestilence. "But it is not the end of the world. The people are fighting it. The sun will rise again tomorrow." For the first time since the invaders arrived, Itzcoatl felt a flicker of something more than just defiance. He felt the hint of a possibility, a change in the wind he could not yet name. The Spaniards' greatest weapon had failed. Their gods, it seemed, had abandoned them. And now they would have to face the Aztec, not as a dying people, but as a living city of 1,000,000 strong, finally beginning to understand the nature of their enemy. The rain fell in cold, hissing sheets, turning the night over the Great Lake into a shroud of black obsidian. It was the perfect cover for a retreat. The Spaniards, laden with gold looted from Moctezuma's treasury, began their desperate flight across the Tlacopan causeway. They moved with the clumsy urgency of thieves, their steel armor clinking a dull, funereal rhythm in the storm. On the rooftops, Itzcoatl gave the signal. A single horn blast, low and mournful, echoed over the water. A younger commander at his side gripped his macuahuitl, his knuckles white. "We will take many fine captives for the gods tonight, Commander," he said, his voice thrumming with the anticipation of battle. "No," Itzcoatl said, his voice as cold as the rain. The commander turned, his expression confused. "Tonight," Itzcoatl continued, looking out into the darkness where the Spanish column was a faint, metallic slug, "we take no one for the stone. The gods will have their due, but not from the priest's knife. They will have it from our blades. Leave none of them alive." The order, so alien to generations of ritual warfare, rippled through the ranks, and then the assault began. It was not the glorious, ritualized charge of the Flower Wars. It was a silent, swarming horror. From hundreds of war canoes, his warriors surged onto the flanks of the causeway. They did not shout war cries to prove their valor. They moved with the grim purpose of exterminators. They ignored the knights on their terrible beasts, instead slashing at the horses' legs, bringing the armored riders crashing down. They did not try to surround and subdue the Spanish foot soldiers. They worked in teams of 3, one to hook a shield away with a hooked club, 2 to drive spears into the exposed throat and armpit. They pulled the heavily armored men, weighed down by their greed, off the causeway and into the dark, churning water, holding them under until the thrashing stopped. From his vantage point on the mainland, Hernan Cortés watched in utter disbelief. This was not the enemy he knew. These were not the honorable, if savage, warriors who sought to capture his men for their gods. These men fought with a chilling efficiency, a coordinated ruthlessness he had never witnessed. He saw a veteran conquistador, a man who had fought in the Italian wars, disarmed and on his knees. The Aztec warrior who defeated him did not pause to take him captive. He simply drove a spear through his chest and moved to the next fight. The causeway became a tomb. The portable wooden bridge the Spaniards had built was lost in the chaos, creating a chasm in their line of retreat. The night drank the lives of hundreds, turning the waters of Lake Texcoco red under the storm. As a bruised and bloody dawn broke over the valley, the full scope of the disaster was revealed. The Spanish army was shattered. A handful of survivors, Cortés among them, had escaped. But their force was broken, their aura of invincibility dissolved in a single night of orchestrated slaughter. Itzcoatl stood on the shore, looking not at the few who had escaped, but at the ruin on the causeway. There was no elation in his heart, only the heavy, cold weight of a necessary act. He had held the fabric of his world in his hands and had chosen to reweave it with blood and iron. The price was horrifying, but the result was survival. The morning after was a strange spectacle of disciplined industry. There was no city-wide celebration, no triumphant parading of captured banners. Instead, on the blood-stained Tlacopan causeway and in the shallow waters of the lake, Itzcoatl's orders were being carried out with grim precision. His warriors, acting as salvagers, moved past the bodies of their own fallen to retrieve the prizes he had designated. They ignored the glint of gold coins and the luster of pearl necklaces scattered across the stone. They labored to drag heavy cannons from the lakebed, their bronze barrels dark with mud. They formed chains to pass along crossbows, steel helmets, and swords, stacking them like cordwood. This was not the looting of a conquered army. It was the meticulous harvesting of a future. Itzcoatl walked among them, his presence a silent command. He stopped to heft a Spanish breastplate, noting the way the plates were articulated. He ran a thumb along the sharpened edge of a halberd. This was the steel that had broken his finest warriors. Soon, it would be his. The Spanish captives were huddled together, a miserable and terrified flock, certain their final destination was the sacrificial stone of the Great Pyramid. Their bravado had been washed away by the rain and the blood of the previous night, replaced by a stark, trembling fear. With Father Aguilar at his side, pale and translating reluctantly, Itzcoatl began his inspection. He did not ask for the captains or the nobles. His questions were far more practical. "Who among you works the forge?" he asked, his voice calm, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Who shapes the iron?" After a long, fearful silence, a burly man with soot-stained hands and a defiant glare was shoved forward. This was Alonso. "Who builds the floating mountains?" Itzcoatl continued. "Who understands the great timbers and the canvas wings?" A man named Martin Lopez, whose hands were calloused from the adze and saw, was identified. One by one, Itzcoatl, through Aguilar's strained translations, separated the craftsmen from the soldiers, the masons, the carpenters, the armorers. They were the true spoils of this war. He stood before the selected group. They flinched as he approached, expecting a death sentence. Instead, he made a simple proclamation, his words delivered by Aguilar in flat, disbelieving Spanish. "You will not be given to the priests," Itzcoatl stated, his gaze sweeping over them. "Your lives are more valuable than your hearts. You will be taken to a place prepared for you. You will be given forges, workshops, tools, and all the hands you require. You will teach my people the arts of your world. You will build for me." He paused, letting the impossible offer settle in the humid air. "Do this, and you will live lives of purpose and honor. Refuse," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "and the high priest will be delighted to welcome you to the top of the pyramid. The choice is yours." He turned and walked away without waiting for a response, leaving the Spaniards to stare at each other in stunned silence. They were not just captives. They had become the unwilling architects of a new era. The throne room of the Huitzilopochtli was thick with tension and the cloying smoke of sacred incense. Moctezuma sat upon his seat of power, but he looked like a man adrift. In the great courtyard beyond the palace doors, a captured Spanish cannon sat, a silent, bronze testament to the new reality. It was Itzcoatl's trophy, and it was a threat. The high priest Takem stood before the throne, his voice ringing with righteous fury. Great speaker, the gods granted us victory. Huitzilopochtli himself guided our blades in the storm, but they demand payment. The cosmic balance is disturbed. These alien demons, these blasphemers, still draw breath in our sacred city. They must be given to the stone. Their hearts must be offered to the sun to purify our lands. His argument was powerful, rooted in centuries of tradition and faith. To deny the gods their due after such a victory was unthinkable. The other priests and nobles murmured in agreement. It was the only way they knew. Then Itzcoatl spoke. He stood alone, without allies, his simple warrior's mantle a stark contrast to the priest's elaborate feathered robes. "The gods did not stop the Spanish cannons, high priest," he said, his voice a low counterpoint to Takem's tirade. "The gods did not blunt their steel. The victory was granted to us when we stopped fighting like priests and started fighting like soldiers. When we chose survival over ritual." He turned his gaze to Moctezuma, who flinched at the intensity. A man's heart can feed the sun for a day, but his knowledge can forge an empire that will command the sun. These captives are not offerings, they are keys. They are the tools we need to ensure there is an Aztec Empire left for the gods to rule. Takem was aghast. "You would bargain with demons. You would learn their profane arts. This is the path of corruption." "It is the path of survival," Itzcoatl stated. "Their floating mountains will return, and when they do, will you stand on the shore and chant prophecies at them, high priest? Or will you stand behind a wall of cannons forged by our own hands?" The silence that followed was absolute. The entire court, the entire empire held its breath, waiting for Moctezuma to speak. He looked from the priest's fanatical certainty to Itzcoatl's terrifying logic. He looked at the cannon in the courtyard. His world was broken, and only one of these men offered a way to piece it back together. His decision was born not of courage, but of a deep, abiding fear of the alternative. "The captives and their devices," Moctezuma began, his voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed with the finality of a collapsing temple. "They will be placed under the authority of Itzcoatl. He has granted the lands west of the lake for his work. He will have the resources he requires." It was done. A revolution sanctioned by the throne itself. The high priest Takem looked as if he had been turned to stone, his face a mask of impotent rage. Itzcoatl bowed his head, a gesture of respect that held no subservience. He gave no sign of triumph. He simply turned and walked from the throne room, his mind already turning to the monumental task of building forges, training artisans, and birthing a new age of iron. Moctezuma was left alone on his throne, the scent of the high priest's incense now smelling like ash. He was the emperor of the most powerful nation in his world, and he had just become a passenger to history. The place had no name, not yet. It was simply called Itzcoatl's Folly * by the whispering priests in Tenochtitlan, and El Infierno *, the Hell, by the Spaniards who lived there. It rose from the marshy western shore of Lake Texcoco, a sprawling, chaotic city of raw timber and blackened earth, walled off from the world not just by a palisade, but by the sheer, radical strangeness of its purpose. This was Itzcoatl's crucible. It was a city dedicated not to the gods or to commerce, but to the systematic deconstruction of one world and the forging of another. The air, unlike the perfumed avenues of the capital, stank of charcoal smoke, boiling pine tar, and the metallic tang of hot iron. The rhythmic chanting of priests was replaced by the dissonant symphony of 1,000 hammers, the roar of bellows, and the grating rasp of saws. Martin Lopez, the shipwright, stood on a rise overlooking the burgeoning shipyard. It was a mockery of every shipyard he had ever known in Seville. Instead of the orderly guild system, there was a frantic, organized chaos. Hundreds of Aztec laborers, directed by Itzcoatl's new Pachteca administrators, swarmed over the massive timbers. their bronze tools seeming pitifully inadequate for the task. Yet they worked with a terrifying diligence, their collective effort achieving what should have been impossible. He was a master craftsman, a man whose knowledge was his kingdom. Here, he was a slave, albeit a gilded one. He was given food, lodging, and a respect that bordered on reverence. But every evening when he laid out his precious, salvaged schematics on a reed mat, an Aztec scribe would sit opposite him, meticulously copying every line, every measurement, every notation into their own pictographic language. They were not just building a ship. They were stealing his soul, one plank at a time. He felt a profound sense of violation, yet, against his will, the sheer, audacious scale of the project, to build a European fleet on a Mesoamerican lake, ignited a flicker of the artisan's pride he so despised in himself. Miles away, in the heart of the folly, Alonso the blacksmith stared into the glowing maw of a new forge. It was larger than any he had ever worked, a clay and stone monster built to his reluctant specifications. His apprentice, a young Aztec boy named Tlaca, watched his every move with an unnerving intensity, his eyes missing nothing. The way Alonso judged the heat of the iron by its color, the precise angle of his hammer blows, the hiss and steam of the quenching trough. Alonso had tried to hold back, to give them flawed techniques, to lead them down paths of failure. But Itzcoatl was a patient and observant master. After a batch of swords proved brittle, shattering in tests, Itzcoatl had simply brought the high priest Tecum to the forge. The priest had not said a word, merely watched Alonso with cold, expectant eyes, his hand resting on a long, obsidian knife. The message was clear. The next batch of swords was flawless. Now, Alonso worked with a bitter resignation. He was teaching Tlaca how to fold steel, the secret art of the Spanish forge. He hated the boy for his quick learning, for the way he was stealing the craft that was his birthright. But sometimes, when the boy successfully executed a difficult weld, Alonso would feel a flicker of something he dared not name, the grudging respect of a master for a worthy student. He was a prisoner, a tool. But here in this smoky hell, he was also a teacher, and that was the most profound torture of all. In the sacred heart of Tenochtitlan, within a lightless chamber deep beneath the great temple, the old world plotted its revenge. Here, the air was thick with the coppery scent of fresh blood from the altars above, and the bitter smoke of ceremonial tobacco. High Priest Tecum stood before a gathering of men whose power Itzcoatl was systematically dismantling. Decorated war leaders of the old guard and nobles whose lineage was tied to the gods themselves. "He calls it progress," Tecum hissed, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. His shadow, cast by a single flickering brazier, danced on the wall like a vengeful spirit. "He calls it survival. I call it a pestilence of the soul. He has saved our bodies from the invaders only to hand our spirits to their demons." He gestured wildly, his hands trembling with rage. "Look what has become of us. The *Pachteca* merchants, the dealers of trinkets, now command more respect than the Jaguar Knights. Our tribute system, meant to honor the gods with beauty and life, is now a ledger for ore and timber. He builds his city of smoke and iron, and with every hammer blow he desecrates the sacred earth." An old, scarred general, a veteran of a dozen flower wars, slammed his fist on the stone table. "He puts their fire sticks in the hands of commoners. He shames the warrior class. The old ways are being forgotten." "They are not being forgotten," Tecum corrected, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They are being murdered. Itzcoatl is the assassin. He won a battle, yes, but he is losing the war for our very identity as a people." The priest's eyes scanned the angry, fearful faces in the room. He saw his opening. "The gods tested us with the invaders," he declared, "and they are testing us now with this blacksmith commander. A true leader would have given thanks for our victory with the greatest of sacrifices. Instead, he sups with the enemy and learns their profane sorcery. He is a sickness, and a sickness must be cut out." The finality of his words hung in the air. This was no longer just a debate. It was a call for sedition. A young, fanatical eagle knight, his face a mask of pious devotion, stepped forward and knelt before the high priest. "I will be the knife of the gods, father," he vowed. "I will cut this corruption from the heart of the empire." Takem placed a hand on the warrior's head, a dark blessing. "It must be done cleanly," the priest whispered, his voice devoid of all its earlier passion, now cold and sharp as an obsidian blade. "It must look like an accident. The folly is a chaotic place. Forges explode, timbers fall. He is not a god, he is mortal. Remind him of that fact." The others murmured their assent, their conspiracy sealed in the sacred darkness. Miles away, under the harsh light of torches in his workshop city, Itzcoatl leaned over a long table. He was studying a complex diagram, a cross-section of a cannon's firing mechanism, a puzzle of springs and levers he was determined to solve. He was entirely focused on the war to come from across the sea, utterly unaware of the far more immediate danger gathering in the shadows of the city he had saved. The explosion was deafening. It was not the clean, contained roar of a cannon, but a chaotic, gut-wrenching blast that tore the heart out of the main forge. A geyser of fire, timber and molten metal erupted into the sky, casting a hellish orange glow over the workshop city. Itzcoatl was thrown from his feet, the shockwave hitting him like a physical blow. For a moment, ringing silence was all that existed. Then the screams began. He rose, his ears bleeding, his mind instantly, chillingly clear. This was no accident. He had seen the flaws in their early casting, the imperfections that led to cracks and failures. This was something else entirely. This was sabotage. He ran toward the inferno, his guards struggling to keep pace. The scene at the forge was one of utter devastation. The massive clay structure had collapsed, and fires raged where its walls once stood. The air was filled with the horrifying stench of burned flesh. Through the smoke, he saw Alonso, the Spanish blacksmith, dragging the limp body of his young apprentice, Tilaka, from the flames. The boy was horribly burned, his life fading with every shallow breath. Itzcoatl's eyes swept the chaos, his strategic mind cutting through the horror. He saw one of his own guards, a man assigned to the forge's perimeter, lying dead 50 paces from the blast, a single, neat puncture wound in his throat. An Eagle Knight's weapon. In that instant, all doubt vanished. The enemy was not across the sea. The enemy was here in his own city, wrapped in the sacred robes of a priest. He turned to his most trusted captain. "Seal the folly," he commanded, his voice raw but steady. "No one enters or leaves. Find the Eagle Knight who was on duty here. Find him now." But the assassin was already gone, having slipped away in the first moments of chaos. Later that night, Itzcoatl stood in the silent ruin of the forge. The fires were out, leaving skeletal timbers black against the moon. Tilaka, the gifted apprentice, was dead. Alonso, the cynical blacksmith, sat on a pile of rubble, his head in his hands, weeping with a grief that transcended his captivity. He had lost his student. Itzcoatl felt nothing. The part of him that might have felt rage or sorrow had been cauterized by the blast. All that remained was a cold, hard certainty. He had tried to build a new world alongside the old one. He had tried to honor the past while forging the future. He had been a fool. The old world did not want to coexist. It wanted to consume. He walked to the center of the ruin and picked up a piece of shrapnel, a twisted piece of Spanish steel, now fused with Aztec clay. He closed his fist around its sharp edges, not flinching as it cut into his palm. The high priest Takem wanted a war of faith. He wanted to fight with prophecies and sacrifices. Itzcoatl would give him a war, but it would be a war of iron, smoke, and fear. He would not just defeat the old ways. He would burn them from the memory of his people and salt the earth where they had stood. The time for debate was over. The time for purification had begun. Itzcoatl returned to Tenochtitlan not as a commander, but as a storm. He did not move on the high priest Takem directly. A frontal assault on the spiritual heart of the empire was crude, and Itzcoatl was no longer a crude man. He moved with the chilling precision of a hunter setting a snare. His new security force, the *Quechuaque*, the Shorn Ones, were his instrument. They were veterans of the causeway, men loyal only to Itzcoatl, and they were armed not with obsidian but with the captured steel of the Spaniards. They moved through the city at dawn, their work swift and silent. They did not arrest priests for blasphemy. They arrested nobles and warrior commanders for treason. The charge itself was a revolution. It was not a crime against the gods, but a crime against the state. The conspirators from Tecum's secret meeting were pulled from their homes, the evidence of their plot, witnesses to their movements, reports from Itzcoatl's spies, presented with cold, undeniable logic. The final confrontation took place in the great plaza at the base of the Templo Mayor. Itzcoatl, flanked by his Shorn Ones, stood before the high priest. Tecum, surrounded by his personal temple guard, radiated spiritual authority. "You dare bring your steel into this sacred ground," Tecum thundered for all the city to hear. "You dare lay hands on the favorite of the gods." "I lay hands on traitors who would see this city burn," Itzcoatl replied, his voice carrying an icy weight that cut through the priest's fury. He held up a twisted piece of shrapnel from the forge. "This is your faith, Tecum. A boy is dead. A forge that would have armed our people against the invaders is a ruin. This is not piety. It is a betrayal. You speak of the gods, but you serve only your own power." That afternoon, Itzcoatl convened a new kind of council. The old nobles were there, cowed and silent. The priests were there, isolated and wary. But for the first time in history, the leaders of the *Pachteca*, the long-distance merchants, were granted seats of honor. And behind Itzcoatl, flanking the speaker's platform, were two of his new cannons, their bronze barrels gleaming, silent arbiters of the new reality. Before them all, Itzcoatl unrolled a new codex. It was not a history of kings or a calendar of rituals. It was a ledger. "The tribute system is reformed," he announced. The images were clear. From the Tarascan territories, a quota of iron ore. From the southern mountains, timber for ships. From the caves to the north, saltpeter for gunpowder. The empire's wealth would no longer be measured in the beauty of jade and quetzal feathers, but in the raw material of war. Then he made his final move. He turned to the eldest of the *Pachteca guild masters. "I name you Calix, first master of the imperial supply," Itzcoatl declared. "Your new guild will oversee the logistics of our survival. You will have the authority of my office. You will feed the forges. You will supply the armies. You will build the foundation of our new world." The old aristocracy could only watch, their power evaporating like mist in the morning sun. Itzcoatl had not simply won a political battle. He had rewritten the rules of power itself. Tecum stood alone, a priest with a temple but no allies, his spiritual authority rendered meaningless in an age of iron and logistics. It was a day of immense pride and crippling fear. Years of labor had led to this moment. The first great Aztec cannon, cast from local bronze and built to specifications painstakingly reverse-engineered by Martin Lopez and Alonso, was ready for its test firing. It was named Smoke Serpent *, and it was the physical manifestation of their new age. Itzcoatl stood on the testing grounds, a wide, barren field within his folly. He was flanked by Calix, the master of imperial supply, whose *Pachteca* had bled the empire for the resources, and by the Spanish craftsmen themselves. Lopez was nervous, checking the weapon's alignment for the 10th time. Alonso, the blacksmith, stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of cynicism, hiding a sliver of an artisan's hope. "The calculations are sound," Lopez muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "The bronze mixture should hold." "It is a glorious day," Calix beamed, his merchant's mind already calculating how many more could be produced. "A weapon to rival the gods." Itzcoatl said nothing. He simply raised his hand and gave the signal. The master gunner, an Aztec trained by the Spanish captives, touched a burning torch to the cannon's fuse. There was a fizz, a spark, and then a deafening crack that was utterly wrong. It was not the deep-throated roar of a successful firing. It was the high, sharp shriek of catastrophic failure. The world erupted in fire and metal. The asterisk smoke serpent asterisk did not fire, it exploded. The bronze barrel, flawed by microscopic impurities in the ore that none of them had understood, peeled open like a ripe fruit, sending jagged shards of superheated metal scything through the air. The devastation was absolute. The gun crew vanished. Calyx screamed as a piece of shrapnel tore through his leg, sending him collapsing to the ground. Itzcoatl was shielded by his guards, but he felt the heat of the blast, saw the mangled bodies of his finest engineers and artisans. In the ringing silence that followed, Lopez stared at the ruined cannon, his face ashen with horror and professional shame. "The ore, the impurities," he stammered. "We did not account for the difference. We scaled up too quickly. It's my fault." Itzcoatl walked toward the smoldering ruin. He ignored the wounded, the dead, the weeping survivors. He stared at the twisted remains of his great weapon. He felt no anger, only a vast, cold emptiness. He had thought he could simply copy the enemy's success. He had been arrogant. Every step on this new path had a price, and it was always paid in blood. He turned to a terrified aide. "Begin again," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "And tell Master Lopez to find the flaw. Tell him to take as long as he needs. And tell him that the next time we test a cannon, the priests will be watching." Years passed. The smoke from Itzcoatl's forges never ceased, and a new generation of Aztec warriors was raised on the hiss of quenching steel and the sharp scent of gunpowder. The army that now marched from the Valley of Mexico was unlike any the world had ever seen. Their destination was the fortress kingdom of the Tarascan Empire, the Aztecs' great historical rivals, a people renowned for their mastery of bronze. The Tarascan king, watching from the walls of his capital, felt a familiar confidence. His armies were strong, his warriors brave, his city unconquered for generations. He prepared for a glorious, traditional war. He did not know he was already a ghost. The Aztec army advanced across the plain. They did not charge. They marched in disciplined blocks, a terrifying fusion of two worlds. The Jaguar Tercio was a forest of long, steel-tipped spears, but its front ranks were composed of men carrying not shields, but heavy, wood-end metal tubes on their shoulders. These were the arquebusiers, the masters of Itzcoatl's new thunder. The Tarascan army, confident in their numbers and their bronze axes, charged forward in a great, screaming wave. The Tarascan king smiled. It was a beautiful, honorable sight. Itzcoatl, observing from a command post, gave a single, sharp command. The front rank of the Jaguar Tercio knelt. 1,000 arquebuses were raised as one. A command was shouted, and a single, deafening volley of fire and smoke erupted from the Aztec line. The sound was a physical blow, a roar that dwarfed the eruption of a volcano. The front line of the Tarascan charge, their greatest champions, their most honored veterans, vanished. It did not break or retreat. It was simply erased from the battlefield in a cloud of smoke and blood. The Tarascan king stared, his mouth agape. The smile was gone, replaced by an expression of pure, uncomprehending horror. His army, which seconds before had been a confident wave of humanity, was now a confused, terrified mob, stumbling to a halt. They had come for a battle of warriors. They had been met by an act of godlike destruction. Before they could recover their senses, the second phase of Itzcoatl's plan began. The Aztec spearmen advanced, not in a rush, but at a steady, relentless pace. The sound of their march was like the grinding of a great millstone, the sound of a world being crushed into dust. The battle was over before it had truly begun. Later, Itzcoatl stood in the great plaza of the captured Tarascan capital. He had not just defeated an enemy. He had rendered their entire history, their entire way of life, obsolete. He turned to Calyx, his master of logistics. "Seize the mines," he ordered, his voice flat. "The bronze, the copper, all of it. Send their smiths to the folly. The great absorption is not finished. It is only beginning." The Aztec eagle was no longer just the symbol of a single nation. It was becoming the shadow that would soon blanket all of Mesoamerica. In the cold, stone halls of the Palace of Valladolid, the world's most powerful man felt like a juggler with too many knives in the air. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Lord of the Netherlands, and Archduke of Austria, listened as reports cascaded over him. The French king plotted against him in Italy. The Ottoman fleet harassed his ships in the Mediterranean. And in Germany, a stubborn monk named Luther was setting fire to the very foundations of Christendom. These were the great matters of state. The news from the New World had, for years, been treated as a distant, irritating sideshow. Cortés's unsanctioned expedition had failed, a tragedy for the men involved, but a minor footnote in the grand ledger of the empire. But the footnotes were becoming a chapter. Today, the Royal Council of the Indies presented a new, terrifying synthesis. Fleeing missionaries and the captured crews of small reconnaissance ships told the same impossible story. An Aztec state that was not broken or dying, but growing. A native army armed not with obsidian clubs, but with steel swords and arquebuses. And stranger still, reports of large, multi-sailed vessels, built in the European style, flying the eagle and serpent banner, preying on Spanish shipping lanes in the Caribbean. The council chamber was filled with stunned disbelief. "It is impossible," declared a portly duke. "Savages cannot learn the arts of steel and sail in a single generation. It is a fiction." "It is a fact," countered a grim-faced bishop, his voice ringing with the certainty of the Inquisition. "And you are a fool if you see it only in military terms. We have not failed to conquer a nation of men. We have failed to recognize the rise of a nation of demons." He slammed his fist on the great oak table. "We saw the New World as a treasury to be emptied and a population to be converted. We were blind. It is a new front in the eternal war, a satanic power, given the arts of darkness to test our faith. This is not a matter for captains and conquistadors. It is a matter for a crusade." The word hung in the air, potent and dangerous. A crusade. Charles V looked at the map, his empire a sprawling, sun-drenched beast that never slept. He was a pious man, and the bishop's words resonated with him. But he was also a pragmatic one. A crusade required money he did not have and his finest soldiers, who were currently occupied holding his European domains together. "A holy crusade will be formed," the emperor declared, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "Spain will not suffer a pagan empire to fester in the lands God has granted us. Assemble the finest minds, draw up the plans, build the ships." But his eyes were distant, already focused on a report detailing French troop movements near Milan. The order was given, but the urgency was lost in the great, grinding bureaucracy of a global empire at war with itself. The great machine had begun to turn, but it would turn slowly. And across the vast, dark expanse of the Atlantic, this delay was the greatest gift the emperor could possibly give his unknown enemy. It was the gift of time, the gift of a generation. The year is 1558. The Caribbean is no longer a Spanish lake. It is a hunting ground. Aboard the flagship of the Aztec wind fleet, the *Zeucotl*, the fire serpent, Captain Acatl stared through a captured Spanish spyglass. The ship under his command was a marvel, a fusion of two worlds. It had the strong, carvel-built hull and the towering masts of a Spanish galleon, but its forecastle was carved into the likeness of a snarling jaguar, and its great sails were dyed a deep crimson, bearing the stark black silhouette of the eagle and serpent. On its deck, bronze cannons gleamed next to ranks of warriors carrying not clubs but rifles. In the lens of the spyglass, Acatl saw his prey, a lumbering Spanish treasure galleon, heavy with the silver of Peru, struggling against the wind. Decades ago, his father had fought the invaders on a causeway with a spear. Today, Acatl commanded a fleet that could challenge any power on the open sea. He gave the order to close the distance. The hunt was a familiar, almost routine affair. They would take the ship, its silver, its maps, and its information, and then scuttle it. The goal was not just plunder, it was strangulation. This power was projected from new seats of Aztec influence. On the island of Hispaniola, where Columbus had first established his colonies, now stood the fortress of Aztlan in the east. It was a bastion of sloping stone walls reminiscent of the temples of home, but bristling with cannons that covered the sea lanes to Europe. The hegemony's reach extended even further. High in the thin, cold air of the Andes, in a city torn by the Incan Civil War, a man named Yaretsi met with an Incan general. Yaretsi was not a warrior. He was a asterisk Pachteca of the highest rank, a master spy in Itzcoatl's new intelligence service. He was dressed as a humble merchant, but the gift he presented was anything but. He unveiled a long crate, revealing a dozen perfectly crafted steel-tipped spears and a single, elegant crossbow. The Huey T. Latony, the great Itzcoatl, watches the struggles of your people with a heavy heart, Yaretsi said smoothly, his Quechua flawless. He offers these tools as a sign of friendship. He believes a strong, unified Inca empire, led by a wise ruler, would be a valuable friend. The Incan general looked at the weapons, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and avarice. He knew the true meaning of the offer. It was a poisoned gift of friendship, an offer of alliance that was, in truth, the first step towards vassalage. The Aztec eagle was casting its shadow even here, at the top of the world. From the Caribbean to the Andes, the New World Order was clear. The Aztec hegemony was no longer fighting for its life. It was playing the great game of empires. The Huey T. Latony, the great speaker Itzcoatl, was an old man now. His face was a mask of deep lines, each one a testament to a decision that had shaped a continent. He sat not in the grand throne room, but in a small, private chamber, its walls lined with codices, not of prophecy, but of naval charts, metallurgical reports, and crop yields. His tutor, the priest Father Aguilar, was even older, a frail man with eyes that had seen too much. For decades, he had been Itzcoatl's window into the European mind, a reluctant teacher bound by the instinct for survival. Their relationship had evolved from captor and captive to something far more complex, a long, unending debate between two worlds. "Your spies in the Inca lands have succeeded," Aguilar said, his voice raspy. "Their civil war deepens. The faction you support will soon be victorious. They will be your vassals, another jewel in your crown." Itzcoatl stared at a map of the world, a strange creation combining Aztec cartography with the coastlines revealed by captured Spanish charts. His empire was a dark, spreading stain across the center of it. "It is necessary," he said, his voice low. "A fractured South is a vulnerability. Spain would have exploited it. I merely did so first." "You did so with their methods," Aguilar countered softly. "You armed one side against the other. You sowed dissent. You learned Cortés's lessons well." Itzcoatl did not flinch. "I learned the lessons of power. They are universal. They are not Spanish or Aztec. They simply are." But later, as he stood alone before a polished obsidian mirror, the hard certainty wavered. The man who stared back at him was the most powerful emperor his people had ever known. He commanded armies that could shatter kingdoms and fleets that could hunt on the open ocean. He had saved his civilization from annihilation. He was a hero, a savior. So why, in the flickering torchlight, did he see the ghost of another man's face superimposed over his own? A man with a hawk-like nose, a fanatical gleam in his eyes, and a lust for gold and glory. The face of Hernán Cortés. He had taken the Spaniards' tools, his steel, his ships, his guns. But had he also taken his soul? He had built an empire to defend his people. But it was an empire that demanded constant expansion, that consumed its rivals, that saw other nations only as resources or threats. He had created a perfect, efficient, ruthless mirror image of the very thing he had fought to destroy. The insight was a cold stone in his gut. He had not offered an alternative to the Spanish way. He had simply proven that the Aztec way, when armed with the same tools, was no different. He had won the war for survival, only to find himself in a prison of his own making, a gilded cage of empire from which there was no escape. The cycles of history, it seemed, were not so easily broken after all. The storm did not come from the sky. It came from the sea. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in the history of the Spanish Empire, a vast armada of over 150 ships. It was a floating city of war, carrying 20,000 men, the finest soldiers of Europe, hardened by the wars in Italy and Germany. This was the Holy Crusade, decades in the making, and it had finally arrived in the New World. Its commander was a man who embodied the unshakable certainty of the Old World, Cardinal Mendoza, the Grand Inquisitor of Spain. He was not a soldier, but a prince of the church, his black robes a stark contrast to the gleaming steel of the knights who surrounded him. He stood on the deck of his flagship, the Santiago, and watched the green, jungle-choked coastline of the Yucatan Peninsula slide past. He felt no fear, only a burning, righteous purpose. The reports had been studied, the strategies debated. They knew of the Aztec cannons, their steel weapons, their strange, hybrid ships. To Mendoza, these were not signs of native ingenuity. They were proof of demonic influence. "They have stolen the arts of Christendom and turned them to the service of Satan," he declared to his assembled captains, his voice carrying across the deck. "We do not come here to conquer land or seek gold. We come here to perform an exorcism on a continental scale. We bring the fire of God to burn out the heart of this darkness." His fleet was a testament to that purpose. It was not a mere invasion force. It was an instrument of purification. Priests stood on every deck chanting prayers. The great banners of the fleet depicted not the royal arms of Spain, but the cross of the crusade. An Aztec scout ship, a swift, crimson-sailed vessel, spotted the armada from a distance and turned to flee, desperate to carry the warning. Mendoza watched it go with a cold smile. "Let it run," he said to his flag captain. "Let the serpent know the eagle has descended. Let them gather their demon-worshipping hordes. Let them see the full, terrible glory of God's wrath. There will be no retreat this time. There will be no night of sorrows. There will only be judgment." The armada sailed on, an inexorable tide of wood, steel, and faith, heading for the heart of the empire it had come to annihilate. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, charged with the promise of the apocalyptic battle to come. The two fleets met in the turquoise waters off the Yucatan, a sight that would be burned into the memory of the world. The Spanish Armada was a floating fortress, a perfectly ordered grid of over 150 galleons, their sails emblazoned with the righteous cross. Facing them was the Aztec wind fleet, 80 crimson-sailed vessels, smaller and more agile, arrayed in a flexible crescent formation. On the deck of the Santiago Cardinal Mendoza raised a crucifix. "God is with us," he thundered. "Charge, break their line and send their demon ships to the bottom of the sea." The Spanish fleet surged forward, a wall of wood and iron, intending to crush the Aztecs with sheer, overwhelming force. It was the only way of war they knew. But the Aztec fleet did not hold its line. Aboard the Zeukotl Captain Acatl gave a series of sharp, coded signals with his flags. In a maneuver that left the Spanish captains baffled, the Aztec crescent flexed and broke apart. The fleet split into smaller, faster squadrons that veered away from the Spanish center, refusing to meet the charge head-on. They used their speed to sweep around the flanks of the lumbering Spanish armada. The battle began not as a single clash, but as a dozen swirling skirmishes. The roar of cannons became a constant, rolling thunder that shook the heavens. The Spanish had more guns, but their volleys were slow, methodical. The Aztecs, drilled for a generation in the arts of naval gunnery, fired with a terrifying speed and accuracy. They did not try to sink the massive Spanish galleons with brute force. They raked their decks with chain shot, shredding sails and toppling masts. They aimed for rudders, crippling the great ships and leaving them helpless in the water. It was a battle of two philosophies. Mendoza's rigid faith against Itzcoatl's fluid pragmatism. They fight like cowards. Mendoza raged as he saw his perfect formation dissolving into a chaotic melee. They will not face us with honor. But Itzcoatl was not interested in honor. He was interested in victory, and he saw his chance. Through the smoke and chaos, he spotted the Santiago the great, gilded flagship of the crusade, now entangled with its own struggling vessels. "Signal the Fire Serpent Squadron," Itzcoatl commanded, his voice cutting through the din. "All ships converge on the Spanish flagship. We will silence the head of the priest." The 5 fastest ships in the Aztec fleet, including the Ziucotl broke from their skirmishes and descended on the Santiago like a pack of wolves. They weathered a furious broadside from the Spanish flagship, the decks of their ships shuddering as splinters filled the air. But they did not falter. They closed the distance, their bronze cannons tearing into the Santiago's hull. Aztec warriors, their faces grim under their jaguar helms, stood ready with grappling hooks and rifles. The 2 flagships, one representing a dying world of faith and certainty, the other a new world of ruthless adaptation, were on a collision course. The fate of the war was about to be decided, not in a grand battle line but here, in the blood and fire of a fight for a single deck. The deck of the Santiago was a charnel house. Cardinal Mendoza, crucifix in one hand, sword in the other, stood amidst the bodies of his knights, his black robe stained with blood. He fought with the fury of a man possessed, his faith an impenetrable shield. The Aztec warriors, led by Captain Itzcoatl, swarmed over the railings. They were not the disorganized savages Mendoza had imagined. They fought with a terrifying discipline, their steel swords and rifles clearing the deck in coordinated waves. Itzcoatl and Mendoza finally met in the shadow of the mainmast. It was a clash of worlds. The cardinal lunged, his Toledo steel a blur of righteous fury. Itzcoatl parried, his own sword, forged in the fires of the new world, ringing against the old. "Demon," Mendoza screamed, his face contorted. "Your soul is forfeit. God himself will cast you into the pit." "My gods are the ones who live on this land," Itzcoatl retorted, his voice calm and cold as he sidestepped another wild swing. "Your god is an invader here." The fight was brief and brutal. Mendoza was a zealot, but Itzcoatl was a warrior, trained since birth for this single purpose. He disarmed the cardinal with a sharp twist of his blade, sending the Spanish sword skittering across the bloody deck. Mendoza stood before him, defenseless, panting, his eyes blazing with hatred. Itzcoatl raised his sword for the killing blow. But then he stopped. He looked at the fanatical old man, at the burning cross on the sail behind him, and he saw not a demon, but a man blinded by his own certainty. Killing him would change nothing. "Your God is dead," Itzcoatl said, his voice low. He turned his back on the cardinal and gave a sharp command to his warriors. "Take the ship, leave the priest. Let him watch his world sink." The Aztec warriors secured the Santiago, taking the remaining knights captive. The great crusader banner was torn down and thrown into the sea. The battle was over. The Spanish armada, leaderless and shattered, was in full retreat, harried at every turn by the victorious Aztec fleet. Cardinal Mendoza was left alone on the deck of his captured flagship, a prisoner on his own vessel. He watched as the Aztec fleet methodically destroyed or captured the remnants of his glorious crusade. He had come to deliver God's judgment, and had found himself judged instead. It was a failure so complete, so absolute, that his faith itself cracked, leaving only a hollow, silent void. On the shore, Itzcoatl received the news of the victory. His fleet had won. The invasion from the sea was broken. But he knew this was not the end. A significant portion of the Spanish army, including their finest infantry, had already made landfall before the sea battle was decided. The final war would not be fought on the water. It would be fought here, on the sacred soil of the empire. The Jaguar tercios against the Spanish tercios, the final test. He gave the order to march. The final battle was a contest of philosophies written in steel. On the plains before the city of Atumba, the last bastion of the Spanish invaders, the two greatest infantries of their respective worlds prepared to meet. The Spanish tercio stood as a near-perfect square, a hedgehog of pikes and muskets, the apex predator of the European battlefield. Facing them were the jaguar tercios of the Aztec Empire, more flexible, with a greater number of riflemen, their ranks a fusion of ancient warrior societies and modern war. The battle raged for hours under the unforgiving sun. The Spanish square was unbreakable, a fortress of men that repelled every Aztec assault. But Itzcoatl, now a withered old man watching from a litter at the rear, had not planned to break it. He had planned to bleed it. His more mobile forces refused to engage the deadly hedge of pikes directly. Instead, they swirled around the tercio's flanks, their riflemen laying down a constant, harassing fire. They were a swarm of hornets stinging a great bear. For hours the Spanish were forced to endure, unable to bring their greatest strength, the pike charge, to bear. They were masters of a war the Aztecs refused to fight. The end came not with a climactic charge, but with a slow, grinding exhaustion. The Spanish square, depleted by attrition and thirst, finally faltered. Their lines buckled. A single jaguar tercio, smelling the moment of weakness, finally charged, their steel-tipped spears shattering the last vestiges of the formation. The surrender was a quiet, professional affair, the lowering of a banner, a Spanish general offering his sword to an Aztec captain. The war was over. Months later, Itzcoatl stood on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. He was ancient, his body frail, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. Below him, in the newly built harbor of Aslan-on-the-Sea, his fleet was being refitted. The captured Spanish galleons were now interspersed with his own crimson-sailed warships. The sound of hammers on iron still echoed the ceaseless rhythm of his new world. Captain Acatl approached him. "Great speaker," he said, his voice filled with reverence. "The ships are ready. The winds are favorable. We await your command." Itzcoatl looked east, across the vast, empty expanse of water that had brought both his peoples near destruction and their ultimate salvation. He had faced the conqueror and become one. He had stared into the abyss and learned its ways. His life's work was complete. Survival was ensured, but survival was no longer the question. "Set a course," he said, his voice quiet, yet carrying the weight of an epic. "Set a course for the rising sun. You are left standing on the shore of a history that never was, watching the crimson sails disappear over the horizon. You are left to wonder what kind of world awaits their arrival. And you have to ask yourself, when a people who were nearly destroyed take to the sea with the weapons of their enemy, do they carry with them liberation, or just a different flag for the same old conquest?"